Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Blue Lamp in Aberdeen, where the combined might of the Aberdeenshire and Aberdeen Alapa Lacus are hosting the 36th meeting of the Wee Alba Book Tour all around Scotland. And what a momentous week to be doing it in, when the Conservative Party in London are about to pick the next captain of the Titanic. Here in Scotland, here in Aberdeen, we're going to be discussing the best route to Scottish independence, so we won't be free of London government for one election, but free of London government for good. So, welcome to the Wee Alba Book Roadshow.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming along tonight. My name is Elaine Mitchell, and I'm going to hopefully chair this in an acceptable manner. I'd like to just introduce you to the panel tonight. We've got Yvonne Ridley, the Women's Convener for Alpa. We've got the Right Honourable Neale Hanvey MP. And I don't need to introduce our party leader for Alpa, Mr. Alex Salmond. Alex is just going to give us a wee speech just now, just to remember someone that we sadly lost yesterday.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, one of the difficult things about the campaign for independence that as it goes on, each and every one of us, those stalwarts of the movement who've been labouring at the independence task for many, many years, and unfortunately passed before independence is achieved, and all of us will have memories of people, of activists who fit into that that category. But if you'll forgive me, I'm just going to say a word about the Stuart Pratt, who unfortunately died the other day. Stuart Pratt, as some of you'll know, was my election agent through 10 election contests in the northeast of Scotland, and he managed to guide me to win 9 of them, which makes him, I think, the most successful election agent in Scottish political history. Not only winning 9 out of 10, but actually getting me to win 9 out of 10, which was an extraordinary achievement. So I've known Stuart for the best part of 40 years. Without Stuart, I would never have become the Member of Parliament. I would never have been selected as the candidate for Banff Bucket. And he's been by my side all that time since, politically, a most extraordinary pillar of the national movement. He exemplifies the people who put in the real work. Wasn't always behind the scenes. Stuart was a councillor for a quarter of a century. He did exceptional work, and he did exceptional work in the community as well. Now, I was thinking about how we could just mark Stuart's passing tonight, and I thought about the moment's silence there. I thought about Stuart, and that's the very last thing that Stuart would have wanted. So what I'm going to ask you to do is to put your hands together with a round of appreciation for Mr. Stuart Pratt.
Start our evening off, and I'm going to introduce you to Yvonne. Thank you.
Hi everybody. Today is a very proud day for me. Not only do I get to share a platform with 2 Scottish politicians who I greatly admire, but I'm continuing a journey of real political awakening which admittedly has been punctuated by a few false dawns and treacherous storms. So, how did a Geordie come to choose Scotland as her adopted home? In a weird sort of way, I owe a debt of gratitude to the sleazy, corrupt bunch of politicians whose snouts were so deeply buried in the trough of Westminster that even today the depth of their greed and entitlement leaves me so breathless and angry. I was living and working in Westminster, where one of the most corrupt ever governments was sitting. It was absolutely impossible to distinguish the difference between Prime Minister Gordon Brown's Labour and David Cameron's Tories. In truth, my disillusionment originally set in back in 2003 when Britain under Tony Blair set out with the Americans on the disastrous Iraq War. I quit the Labour Party. I joined as a teenager, and the following year I became one of the founders of the Respect Party, only to see its meteoric rise falter and then dramatically implode by 2011. I was politically looking for a way out. Westminster was still very much embroiled in the sleaze and fallout of the all-party expenses scandal which erupted in 2009. More than 1 million documents laid bare the full extent of corruption and greed of MPs from all parties. Snouts in the trough, as I say, it's an understatement. That, together with the banking crisis and the absence of a referendum on the Lisbon Treaty, enabled the emergence of the right-wing UKIP, which just set British politics on a toxic path of hatred, and we can see the effects of that today. There was no escape, and I just thought, I'm going to have to move overseas. Then I started hearing these rumblings about the rebellious Scots threatening independence. It was 2011, and Alex Salmond, re-elected as MSP for Aberdeenshire East, was not only setting out his plans for a second term as First Minister, but he promised to call a referendum on Scottish independence. The Westminster Labour government had initially designed a voting system that would make it impossible for one party to win an outright majority. But under Alex Salmond, he did it by taking 69 seats, creating a majority of 4. It was an astonishing feat. And although Scottish politics rarely makes headlines in England, it certainly did create a few tremors in Westminster, so I just thought, I want some of that. As good as his word, he delivered, and I headed north. I joined the SNP, like thousands of others, to work for the 2014 referendum. I moved to the Scottish borders, having made my escape from London, and the rest, as they say, is history. Today, Holyrood is still in the hands of the SNP, as we all know. But the bad news is this is a very different SNP to the one that I joined. Despairing and facing being politically homeless yet again, and with a party which had lost its way and grown too comfortable and complacent, I thought again about selling up and scarpering. But there comes a time when you've got to stop running and deal with the hand that you've got. I was thrown in ace when the emergence of Alba happened, as I'm sure a lot of people in this room were, and became one of the founder members. Scotland, as you know, is a fantastic country, and far enough away from the stench of Westminster most days, although I think we've all been enveloped in the fallout from this latest Tory Prime Minister. just in case you need reminding, Elizabeth or Liz Truss. The truth is, it is the people who make Scotland, and the people who live here are of the highest pedigree in terms of courage, determination, character and integrity. This is my home now, and you are my family. As I said before, Holyrood was supposed to provide the means of escape from the clutches of Westminster, but instead it has become trapped in a political cul-de-sac of its own making. An extension of all that is rotten in the UK Parliament. Cruelty, injustice, intolerance, racism, bigotry and oppression are the bywords that have come to define Westminster. You might think Holyrood has the freedom to object, to think and speak out about the injustices foisted on the people of Scotland, but in recent years very little has been achieved by the Scottish Government. This last Prime Minister said she would just ignore Scotland's First Minister, and she did. It's probably the only thing that Liz Truss didn't do a U-turn on. Under the SNP leadership 15 years ago, it was progressive and its policies were brave and radical, but today it is looking tired, bereft of ideas. Sadly, dreams of independence have started to slide away. After the heroic results of 2014, and they were heroic, I've never seen so many happy people, although we lost. It was a brilliant benchmark that we'd set. So after that heroic results, we were put back in the starting blocks in readiness for Indy Ref 2. It happened so many times, waiting for Nicola Sturgeon to blow the whistle, that I think that we all started to feel weary. But as Abraham Lincoln once said, you can fool some of the people all of the time, and all of the people some of the time, but you cannot fool all of the people all of the time. The game is up, Nicola. We see you. Fear probably got the better of some as the SNP powers that began to demand silent, obedient consent, don't rock the boat from the membership. But you can only keep good people down for so long. Scotland is a nation of dreamers, and the dream of independence and overriding desire of the poor and the privileged alike, you can't suppress that. There are still many good people in the SNP, but they have been undermined by a party which promotes the same paternal attitude that those in power at the top know best. This selfish motivation to cling on to power undermines the value system of independence and nation building. It's as though those who sit in Westminster and Holyrood are terrified of losing their grip on power. They come up with arguments about why Scotland needs to remain under Westminster control and why we are not quite ready for independence. Can you imagine if we had got independence in 2014? How better off we would be today. We'd probably still be in Europe or determine exactly what way in which we want to commit to Europe in terms of relations with the European Union. We'd certainly not be lying awake, afraid of our power and energy bills, interest rates and mortgages. More importantly, today we would merely be spectators of the high drama and chaos of Westminster and not be sucked into its destructive vortex. However, we are where we are, but this little blue book, the Wee Alba Book, is our second chance. It has all the answers we need to get out. And It will answer all the burning questions about currency, pensions, trade, energy. The list is not exhaustive and it's been constantly revisited and updated. Stability has been a buzzword in Westminster and it's often used by the media in troubled times. Well, if it's stability you want, then check the record of Alex. I certainly have. And he set out many years ago on the journey for independence, long before me. I'm not trying to make you feel old here, Alex, because I'm no spring chicken. But on that journey, he's never wavered, halted, or deviated from the route. Despite everything that has been thrown at him over the years, he has never once left the journey. I know I can place my trust in him. He is the king of the political fight. I think it was Nelson Mandela who said, "Do not judge me by my successes, judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again." And that's what we have to do. We've got to keep on going, keep on rising, and keep on heading in the direction of independence. And I know we will get there eventually. Thank you.
Very much, Yvonne, and full marks to you for getting the name of the Prime Minister correct. Well done. I'd now like to, just before I hand over to Neale, can I just remind everyone that we have raffle tickets for sale and lots of things. Irene and Teresa will help you out with that. Now I'll hand you over to Neale Hanvey, MP. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here tonight, and what extraordinary times we live in at the moment. This week's events have been entirely predictable because it was clear long before Liz Truss was selected as a candidate for the Tory leadership that she just wasn't up to the job, and boy did she prove her doubters correct. This is a time for leadership and commitment to vision and an opportunity to grab the moment, to seize the day. And I'm not talking about Liz Truss, her time has passed. I'm talking about the Scottish Government, Scottish Members of Parliament, MSPs. We should be galvanised absolutely behind a call for the legislation to bring forward a referendum bill through the Scottish Parliament. The Supreme Court have already said it's absolutely within the rules for that legislation to come through the Scottish Parliament, and if it was in place, as the Scottish Government were asked to do, if it had been in place, that would have had a material impact on the outcome, because where the Supreme Court are at the moment is they're considering this case in exactly the same way that the Scottish Government used arguments to defeat Martin Keating's case. So the Scottish Government have undermined their own case from years back. It's absolutely outrageous. And not only do we need to bring that bill through, we need to bring all of our elected members together, all the independent supporting elected members, and indeed others if they're willing, to consider how we progress as a country and how we deal with this mess that is happening in Westminster. It really is quite staggering that what we do witness is the leader of the SNP in Westminster and the leader of the SNP in Scotland commenting from the sidelines as if it's some spectator sport, as if it doesn't really matter. Time's on our side. It isn't on our side. It's absolutely imperative that we strike and strike now. And that's something that I've been calling along with Alex and other voices in the movement, because it's absolutely necessary that we use this opportunity to push the case for independence. We have had many opportunities since 2016 and the vote for Brexit, but we haven't seen any real ambition to move the dial on independence, to campaign on the streets and reinvigorate the people as they were in 2014. And even with opinion polls that say, if this condition's met or that condition's met, then the support does go up to that so-called magical 60%. One recently, a couple of weeks ago, with a well-being commitment, would see support for independence climb to 60%. Now, we've got to harness that energy, but it's just not happening in the SNP at the moment. So I just want to, what's a wee boy for Belfast with a Fife accent doing in Aberdeen, talking to Scots and new Scots about independence? Well, I left Scotland in 1993 because I couldn't get a full-time job in the NHS, and I went to London, and I had everything funded in London. My master's degree, everything was paid for. That was something that would never have happened in Scotland. The funding just wasn't there, and that was at the tail end of Thatcherism and the destitution that had been forced on many of the communities that I was involved in through the work in the NHS. And I came back to Scotland in 2009, and boy, was that a surprise. It was just such an amazing feeling. I came back to a country that had rediscovered itself at the evolution. There was a confidence in the people that I hadn't seen when I was younger. And they carried themselves with more confidence and more swagger than I had ever witnessed. And the cringe seemed to be disappearing. And that really came down to, certainly in my view, came down to one man's leadership. And so it is a strange but really surreal experience to now work alongside Alex Salmond and another political hero, Kenny McCaskill, but also the rest of the team, Taz and all of our conveners in the party, because the energy in Alba is absolutely focused on independence, as you would expect, because our leader is an internationally respected former First Minister, and he absolutely deserves the Right Honourable in front of his name. If anyone has earned that in Scotland, it's certainly Alec. So when I joined the SNP, when I came back up to Scotland, or rather, as I like to think, when I joined the cause of independence, my first campaign was the 2011, where Alec won that historic and unparalleled absolute majority for the Scottish Parliament. I trotted along to the Jam House straight after the result, and Alec was there, and he was strutting to the stage, taking all the plaudits, which he absolutely deserved. But then, I could never have imagined the time that I spent tapping on his vast knowledge and enjoying his company and guidance. And he really is an absolute giant politically, and he is incredibly generous with his time and experience. But that collaborative approach is the only way that we win independence. And that is probably best shown by his performance as First Minister with team, record and vision, and that was the winning message in 2011. Because those policies worked for the people. And I believe that Alec leads a party that is interested in the common weal of the Scottish people. That's the motivation, it's my motivation, and it's certainly something that I pick up from everyone around me in Alba. What we aren't, we're not meek, we're not timid, and I don't think we are self-interested politicians. That's the attraction for me of the Alba platform. Now the Wee Alba Book, which you'll be able to see tonight, explains many of the arguments and updates many of the issues that were considered in 2014, but it brings them into modern times because the political landscape has changed and changed significantly. But the current Westminster cohort of politicians, they will never aspire to the policies that are explored in the Wee Alba Book. They will never put the people of Scotland first, because Westminster is the centre of their universe, and Scotland keeps the treasury pumped full of cash, and the corporations full of profit. And so there is no focus or wish to see independence, so we must continue to fight that corner for Scotland. And what we don't need, and what is most disappointing in Westminster, is we don't need Scottish MPs who are supposedly in favour of independence spending their time dotting the I's and crossing the T's on Tory policy that undermine the welfare of our people, and spend our time trying to politely persuade them that independence might be a good idea all round. You know, who are they trying to persuade? Well, they're trying to persuade those folk who have self-interest in maintaining the current position of Scotland. You know, what I've experienced as an MP since 2019 has been really quite surreal. The last time I was in this pub was after the SNP conference in 2019, and I went to the Women's Pledge meeting, and we came in here for a drink afterwards. And so it's quite strange being back here, because so much has happened since then. And you know, I made a decision to speak out, both on the Women's Pledge prior to that election, and once I was in Westminster, about the absolute lack of a strategy, the lack of any focus on mounting arguments for independence in Westminster. And I didn't think, as you know, I put myself in the position as an independent supporter. If I knew that that was happening, or if I didn't know that was happening and I was still supporting these guys, how would I feel if nobody told me? And I felt that there was a responsibility to call it out. Now, it's made me unpopular, and I get that, but I still believe that it was right to speak up. And it was right for so many reasons to move to Alba, not least because I can have that peace in myself, but I know I'm campaigning for independence and not my own career in the future. But independence is just a gateway. And where we are in terms of policy development, from the Scottish Government perspective, is quite a few steps away from a convincing argument. We're not clear about currency. The position that the Scottish Government are taking at the moment on sterlinisation is absolutely ludicrous. The position on the EU is equally ludicrous, because you need your own currency if you're going to apply to go into the EU, and it's going to take 5 years. So these are missteps that have been made in their refreshed, to use a generous term, refreshed documents. And we must convince, as a movement, as an independence movement, we must convince the people of Scotland that that is only but one prospectus for the future. And so we believe that Scottish currency, call it the spondulic, somebody suggested to me the other day, or in, you know, whatever it's called, that's essential. And if we want to bring forward our industry and inject some energy into the economy, then we need to have access to European markets. And so our position is to join EFTA in a matter of weeks and be ready upon independence to meet that challenge. But of course we face really significant challenges in Scotland at the moment. We're an energy-rich nation, and our people are fuel poor and living in poverty. And again, the dial has not moved on these issues. In fact, it has gotten worse. So if I just think about in my constituency, Bifab used to have yards in Hunt Island and along the coast of it in Methil. When I was first elected and back in the SNP, I found an engineering company from the States who were looking for a site. The Bifab yards were perfect for them. They had funding, they had energy, and they had the resources to move that forward and create employment in my constituency. All of that information was passed to the Scottish Government and to the receivers who were looking after the bid, and it was ignored. and it was sold to Harland and Wolff, and those yards still lie empty. Now those opportunities we should have been at the front of the queue for, and all of that has been lost. And then we have Scotland, where £350 billion valued licence was auctioned off for £700 million, and it's just absolutely staggering in its short-sightedness. And there's Berwick Bank, and there's a whole list of challenges that we face as our energy is drawn away from Scotland to, again, as I said, pump the treasury full of cash and the corporations full of profit. What we must do is deliver tangible benefits. We must lift our people out of the suffering that they currently experience. There are far too many people drinking themselves to death, taking drugs because they can't stand the pain of life under Conservative rule. We need to have a vibrant economy where employment is well paid and secure. We need to give people who need welfare a decent life. Protect education, protect the NHS. This is not about one person or one party or one argument or one prospectus. It is about all of us. It's about that common weal. It's about having a sense of who we are as a people. And the most important thing is that we build a country where people feel and believe that they matter. Now, in the Alex Salmond led Scottish Government, that was built at a time of the 2008 financial crash. But there was still the vision and the team spirit and policy to drive forward really measurable achievements for the Scottish people during that time. And it shows you that with a bit of gumption, guts and spirit, you can transform a country even in the most difficult circumstances. Now, people say that we can't go forward with independence in the midst of this chaotic economic situation. And I say that yes, we can, absolutely. It is the only way forward in these chaotic times. We must have the full levers of independence so that we can build that better country that our people deserve. Now, I'm going to hand over now to the man who achieved so much, who made Scotland invigorated and gave it that confidence those years ago, and someone whose spirit for Scotland has never been diminished. And it's my great honour to work alongside the outstanding and very humble Alex Salmond.
Thanks very much to Hanvey there for that great speech, and thanks for pushing as hard as you can down in Westminster. It's good to have you and Kenny there fighting for our cause of independence. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and friends. And I was just thinking as I was sitting listening to both Yvonne and Neale, that a story that Jim Sillars once told me. Jim Sillars was the Member of Parliament for South Ayrshire, and his predecessor was Emrys Hughes, who was a mining MP, came from mining stock. He was a hard man. And Jim told me a story about Emrys Hughes and Winston Churchill in the mid-1950s. Winston Churchill, the wartime leader, great statesman, etc., but by the mid-50s he was well past his best. He had a series of strokes, and he was clearly not capable of being Prime Minister, but he was determined not to hand over to Anthony Eden, for reasons best known to himself, and so he stayed on, and rather like Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, he kept promising Eden he was about to hand over but never did. And they were covering up just how incapacitated Churchill had become. Now in the House of Commons, if you ask a detailed question of a minister, what happens is the civil service has a box and they pass the reply. If you ask, how many billions of dollars in the current hard currency reserves, and what happens is the Treasury Minister will get a note passed to him from the Civil Service, and they'll say, 22.7 billion last Friday, or whatever the exact question is. So what happened one day at question time, Churchill was at the dispatch box, and he was being asked a whole range of questions. Emrys Hughes got up and said, "Who's the Foreign Secretary?" Sat down. And the answer was passed along the front bench to Churchill. And it was like the king has no clothes on moment. It was the moment where everybody realised that, great man though he undoubtedly was, Churchill had no longer had the mental capacity to be in the position of Prime Minister. Now why is that relevant? Well, it's relevant because the current Conservative Party leadership, collectively, don't have the mental capacity to be Prime Minister of any country at the present moment. And the trouble with all of this is, what does it say about us? I mean, it's bad enough the Conservative Party picking people like this, every one more extreme and worse than the previous one. Although the previous one wants to come back for a second go. I mean, I'm all in favour of that, incidentally. But usually you wait more than 6 weeks before you make the incredible comeback. So what does it say about us for? This trust, and we get to stages. I mean, I was quite interested in some of the vox pops, because all people were quite angry. They were angry about their mortgages, angry about their heating bills, angry about the pressure on their family budgets, really angry. There was an element of sympathy in some of the things people said, because they could quite clearly see that the lady wasn't up to the job. It was evident. It was painful to watch. It was almost it was like an incredibly one-sided football match. I know, as a Hearts supporter, I've seen a number of them. Not least of which recently against Aberdeen. But so it got to the stage where it was agonising. You felt sorry for this person. You were opposed to her politically. You didn't like her politics. You didn't like her attitude. You didn't like the Tory arrogance. But she was clearly not up to the job. But if she's not up to the job and the Westminster system is falling apart, what on earth is Scotland doing, allowing these people who are clearly incapable of dictating our future? I mean, I can understand if the people who are saying no to Scotland, who are saying now is not the time, you can't have it, you can't do it, we're not letting you do it. They were giants in the political system. I can understand that. But who on earth, apart from Scotland, has Liz Truss been able to say no to? She's caved in on every single aspect of her programme in the course of 6 weeks. She's laid down her friend, the Chancellor, to attempt to save her political life. She's done everything she possibly could to survive. She's turned turtle on everything except Scotland. Because she's never been asked. She's never been pressurised. She's never been put in the position of climbing down. And what was said yesterday as the final denouement and embarrassing collapse of the Truss administration? What was the SNP spokespeople saying? What would Nicola Sturgeon say? We've got to have an election. Yep. Okay. We're going to have an election. Well, let's just say, for the sake of argument, that the Conservative Party decided that things have got so bad that collectively all 350 of them are going to commit hara-kari and have an election. But the one remaining thing they agree on is we're not having an election. But let's just say they said, oh my goodness, Ian Blackford has said we have to have an election, so we better do it. Well, it's the what, the 21st October. Could easily find an election this year. And I heard Ian on the radio this morning trying not to say there could be an election. Yes, there could, Ian. If they'd taken your advice and called an election, we'd have one in early December, maybe even late November. Too early, apparently, for a plebiscite election, which is meant to be the core strategy if the Supreme Court has the temerity to turn down the legal case. So, what would be achieved for Scotland for the election? Yes, of course, what we would do is remove from the Scottish people a ridiculous, conservative, oppressive government and replace it by a ridiculous, red, conservative, oppressive government. Wonderful. Actually, fact Keir Starmer is somewhere to the left of Liz Truss, but he's certainly not to the left of Boris Johnson. They're roughly in the same position. Have we not noticed? Liz Truss is not the only person who's been dismantling every aspect of policy. She just did it in 6 weeks. Starmer's been doing it over the last 3 years. Because when the Labour Party had an alternative programme to bring to people, an alternative to the Conservatives, they elected a leader who dismantled it and has shadowed the Conservatives. This is the leader, remember, who sacks people for going on to picket lines to support workers defending their jobs and livelihoods. This is not your classic Labour Party leader. This is a non-Labour Party leader. But for Scotland, are we really saying that the sum total, as we watch the disarray and disintegration of the Conservative Party at Westminster, is to have an election and hand this red Tory a majority of 200 when he has set his face against the self-determination and rights of the Scottish people? Wouldn't it be better, as Neale Hanvey said, to say, look, as Ireland used to say, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. Westminster crisis is Scotland's opportunity. The meltdown at Westminster is the opportunity to introduce the independence referendum bill in the Scots Parliament, which the Supreme Court obligingly pointed out does not need the permission of the Lord Advocate. It's called taking an initiative, seizing the agenda, applying political pressure. Who knows? With no working Prime Minister at all over the next week, it might have the desired effect to put Scotland front and centre of the political agenda, as opposed to just being the ADO and, oh, the SNP want a general election, which you're not going to get as well. Or alternatively, what Neale and Kenny have been consistently calling for is for Scots MPs and Scots MSPs to meet together as a constitutional convention to advertise Scotland's claim of right to the world, mobilising civic Scotland. That's what's been done through our history. In the 14th century, they called it the community of the realm. In the 17th century, it was the estates of Scotland. In the 21st century, it's civic Scotland. But the key to it is the responsibility lies from those who've been entrusted with that precious gift of Scottish sovereignty by the Scottish people, who are the sovereign nation, and meant to exercise it responsibly for the nation's benefit. So it really isn't enough to sit in the green leather benches and chuck, we need an election. What you're meant to say in the green leather benches is, time's up for this place, we're going back to Scotland, we're going to mobilise Scottish opinion, and we're going to force you to acknowledge Scotland's right to self-determination. That is a political strategy. Now that VAR has been introduced into Scottish football, I'm now going to have the pleasant experience of watching the highlights of the last few years, as opportunity after opportunity wasn't taken to seize the initiative in Scotland. I mean, and I thought Brexit, would have been the greatest opportunity of all. I mean, the greatest illustration of why Scotland cannot continue in a union which says you can't even be a member of Europe if you vote overwhelmingly to be one as a European nation. So wouldn't that be the point, to press the button on independence, as opposed to saying, we are going to combine to tell the English that you made a mistake and you've got to change your mind? Well, there's a kind of problem with that. And that is that England is 10 times the size of Scotland. And it's the ultimate vanity to believe we're going to tell the English people, you made a of it, you've got to change your mind. Why? Because Scotland says so. You know, they have the right, like it or not, to exercise their self-determination, even if they make mistakes, just as we've got the right to exercise our self-determination. So all these chances and opportunities, but we've now reached a point where it cannot be allowed to slide away and slide on. There is an absolute responsibility of any self-respecting Scottish MSP and MP to force the issue of Scottish independence. That's what it's about. That's why they came into politics. That's why I came into politics all these years ago when Stuart Pratt guided me through the Bath and Buchan selection meeting or many selection meetings of the SNP. And the other responsibility is to be prepared. Because if you're going to bring the issue to the crunch, you've got to have the perspective that will stand up the examination of a referendum or any other electoral test. And quite plainly, last Monday when the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the new Chancellor, I mean incidentally, if somebody asks you now who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, you'd be well excused for not knowing. I mean, but the latest time, Jeremy Hunt appeared in I could tell why he was making his broadcast short, incidentally, last Monday. So I'm going to get you here as quick as possible. I'll speak for a couple of minutes and I'll say, everything's a disaster, it'll make you weep. There's going to be tax rises here, I'm reversing this, I'm reversing that. Bye. You know, that was Jeremy Hunt's broadcast. And, you know, then the culmination of work that the SNP and its host of advisors and civil servants had put into the Economic Manifesto, right? I just wish I'd sent them all a wee copy of the Alba book, just to have a think about things. Now, I campaigned in favour of the European Union and the referendum. I like the European Union. And if we were starting from scratch and in the European Union as we were back in 2014, I'd be happy to stay in the European Union. Not because I thought everything the European Union does is perfect. I mean, I represented a fishing constituency for a quarter of a century. I know it's not. But because it's a good place to be. But we're not there at the present moment. Brexit has happened. That is a reality. And on the very most optimistic, benign interpretation of how long it would take Scotland to get back into the European Union is 5 years. That's the Kirsty Hughes estimate. Now that's a friendly estimate. But let's say it was 5 years. Can I just put it to that common sense will dictate. If you're sitting in independence negotiations, which if they take 18 months to 2 years, 5 years as a perspective for joining the European Union ain't much use to you. You've got to have a safe anchorage to go to for these negotiations. Otherwise you'll be taken to the cleaners, both by Westminster and then by the European negotiator. You know, Michel Barnier, remember him? He was the European negotiator in the Brexit negotiations. Now, I know Michel Barnier loves Scotland. He loves whiskey, he loves coming on his holidays to Scotland, he thinks bagpipe music is wonderful. He's a real Scotophile. If we've been negotiating with him, the fact he's a Scotophile won't make a whit of difference. He'll negotiate the best deal for his principals, the rest of the European Union, when it comes to fishing and oil and all the rest of it. That's his job. And therefore you mustn't go into any negotiations from a position of weakness. And the 5-year reality that it takes to rejoin the European Union would be a critical weakness in any independence negotiation. So what do? Do we all pack up and go home and say, if only we'd voted the other way in 2014? Or alternatively, you look around and realise there's another organisation called EFTA, the European Free Trade Association. It has 4 countries, Iceland, Norway, Switzerland, Liechtenstein. Can't be a bad place to be, incidentally, because all 4 are in the top 10 of wealth per head in the world. Doesn't mean if you join EFTA, you get automatically into the top 10, but it does tell you it's not a bad place to be. Right, what's the big issue with EFTA in Scotland now? It takes 3 months to join EFTA, maximum, and you know you'll get in. So it's totally compatible with the negotiation. Then you join EFTA, you've got the option then of signing up to all of EFTA's trade treaties with the rest of the world. That's your option. It can be used as a route into the single market, to the European Economic Area. And it doesn't have you sitting like a pillock at independence negotiations, which you're meant to believe are about to happen, knowing that they know it's going to take you 5 years to get into the European Union. You mustn't put yourself, you know, Ernest Bernard was, or Bernard said, you weren't going to go into the conference chamber naked in terms of nuclear disarmament. Well, you'd certainly be in a disadvantageous position if you believe you can wait 5 years to have an answer to a question that's going to be important to negotiation. But luckily for us, and that's why the Wee Alba Book extols the virtues of EFTA as an organisation, because it provides a safe anchorage for an independent Scotland that can be negotiated in a timescale compatible with the independence negotiations of Westminster. I couldn't believe the other stuff. I mean, the currency stuff. Well, you know, I'll defend to my dying day that if you're in a European Union with your major trading partner and it's sterling as a secure term currency, then you could have a partnership agreement. Of course you could, but that's no longer the position. I mean, the dogs in the street know that sterling's no longer a stable currency. Sterling is out of the European Union. It's a speculator's paradise. You know, Liz Truss managed to have it through the floor and interest rates through the roof in no time whatsoever. So it's not the place to be anymore. It just isn't. And just like pregnancy, you can't be half pregnant, you can't be half in a currency. And if you say to people, look, we're going to sterlingize, but after we meet 5 economic tests, at some time, we'll have our own currency. You'll never have your own currency because it'll be used as a speculative instrument again, so we test it all the time. If you're going to move your own currency, you've got to do it for the defined, immediate time scale of independence. That's where it's been done successfully elsewhere. Now we know this, so why haven't the SNP caught up with it? Because they'll need to know it for independence negotiations. Similarly with trade and borders. I mean, the SNP have been running away from the issue for years. You only have to say 2 words to answer a borders question just now. Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, which we're all told is a dreadful problem with the protocol. Actually, the protocol is being attacked in Westminster, not because it's a failure, but because it's a success. That Northern Ireland, for the first time, when economic records began, in terms of the country's United Kingdom, is performing better than the other countries. Why? Because the marginal inconvenience of the checks on businesses, not at the borders, but on businesses, of the Northern Irish Protocol has been overwhelmed by the surge in trade with the single market. It is, as Boris Johnson once said, the best of both worlds. And it's exactly the position that Scotland would have with the rest of the UK if we were in EFTA with EFTA's trading agreements and part of the single marketplace. Nothing whatsoever to be frightened of, and we've got to have the ability to translate these arguments to the people. But you know, friends, in economics, the most important thing I was ever told was my old boss and Grant Baird, the chief economist of the Royal Bank, all these years ago. He said, remember, Alec, for most folk, anything over $1 million is just a big number. Economic arguments and debates are not going to be won by talking about billions or millions or transition periods or all the rest of it. They're going to be run by common sense. And the biggest common sense right now to ram home that argument is the one that Neale mentioned. We're in a land of energy plenty. So why are our people being covered in fuel poverty? It costs, for big energy, we could produce 10 times the energy that Scotland needs in terms of electricity for £50 a megawatt hour and less. It costs 9 times that to produce it from gas, where England relies on for 50% of its electricity just now. And if we go down Starmer's Road and have Great British Energy, the nuclear company, the public nuclear company, it'll cost a minimum of 100 a megawatt hour plus the rest of the nuclear subsidies. So just common sense tells you that if in your land of cheap, affordable, green, clean energy, enough for every household, enough to attract energy-intensive industries from around the world to this country which has been endowed with a quarter of Europe's energy resources in terms of renewables, then why on earth should every homeowner, every household, every family, every business be paying through the nose for sky-high energy prices? That's the common sense, and that's the argument we'll get across. And if the economic crisis of the United Kingdom over this year has really been a story about the ill-preparedness, the inability to coherently control the energy markets and use that disadvantage to impoverish the people and impoverish business, then we should be able to get across the story that that resource can power the Scottish economy, not just guaranteeing affordable energy for every home, but guaranteeing the competitive position of Scottish industry and business and prosperity. And for here, in the northeast of Scotland, where the big lesson of the last half-century is, for goodness sake, do not allow your energy resources to be controlled by the London Treasury and international capital. You'll end up with very little but the crumbs from the table. The fact that the Scotland auction was a scandal is a national disgrace. We should have a public share in every single one for nothing of the bid. Renewable fuels represented. And when Steer Cameron said we'll have great British energy, our answer will be no. We'll have the Scottish Public Energy Company who will deliver Scotland's natural resources and their benefits at last to the people who own them, the Scottish people. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Alex. Great words there. We're now going to move on to some questions, and just before we start, I'm reliably informed that there's still a chance to buy a raffle ticket, so get in touch with Irene and Teresa. Thank you. Now, I spent 40 years in the NHS, and most of that time trying to decipher the consultant's writing was the biggest challenge, so hopefully we'll get through these questions tonight. So the first one, sadly to say, Neale, you've lost a vote. He used to be in your constituency, but he's now not. So it's from Jim Dryborough. He wants to ask the panel, can we go knocking on doors to get indie supporters to sign up online? And can we get SNP on side with us? Because this should strengthen our team, I would have thought. Would like to do it?
Yep.
What's the first part
Can we
was?
go knocking on doors?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there's 2 points I would make on the campaigning, and Alec has been making these points for some time now through these meetings and elsewhere, which is we've got a date. We may not, well, we may have varying confidence about whether anything's going to happen then or not, but we need a strategy to inform a campaign. And so the current hiatus is that we're campaigning. This is Alapa campaigning. We're trying to increase public awareness through these meetings of the cause and the case for a renewed push for independence. The difficulty is that the SNP are effectively the leadership of the movement at the moment, and I haven't seen any real energy or enthusiasm for a push for independence. My first meeting when I joined the SNP group in Westminster, that was the first question I had was, when are we going to talk about independence? What's the strategy for independence? How does that thread through every area of policy? And I was kind of not even laughed out of the room, the virtual room, but it's like I'd let a stink bomb off. And so it really was quite disorientating. So in terms of getting us all back together, we've reached out a hand of friendship repeatedly. I have probably a more constructive relationship with many members of Parliament from other parties than I do with my former colleagues. Not all of them, but you know, I think there's a way to go there. But we've got to just push ahead. You know, this independence, as I said, doesn't belong to a single person, a single party. It belongs to every single one of us, and it's incumbent on everyone to make the effort to work towards that goal. And so, you know, all we can do is try our very best to be collaborative and continue to work within the spirit that we had in 2014. I certainly will continue to do that, but what I won't do is be told not to campaign for independence. I won't accept that. That is an unacceptable instruction.
Well, way back in the days when I was trying to become the SNP candidate for Bamford Buchan, and I told the staff of the Constituency Association that, because you know, when you're 30 years old, you tend to know everything. And, so I said, no, I've got it all worked out. I said, what we do, you see, as a party, we replace Labour as the dominant party in Scottish politics. And they said to me, wouldn't that take a wee while? And I said, yes, absolutely, of course it will. But in the meantime, every time we make an advance, we'll find that the Labour Party rediscovers its enthusiasm for a Scottish Parliament. And devolution, which, you know, they'd largely forgotten about since 1979 at that stage. Now, Alpa's in a similar position to the SNP than the SNP were to the Labour Party back in the late 80s. I mean, you know, they were the colossus in charge of Scottish politics. The SNP were the midgie, which was annoying to them on occasion. But lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. Every time the SNP won a by-election like Govan or advanced 5% in the system's fee opinion poll, hit 20%, then the Labour Party, before you could say Constitutional Convention, had decided to do something about it. So that's how political parties operate. And Alpa's got no choice in this. Alpa has to win elections, and that's why at the conference last week we introduced a new canvassing system. That's why we're contesting local by-elections in Glasgow and West Lothian, and you'll see us building up until you'll see the sound of electoral success. And what will happen? The first seat that Alpa win, maybe even before that, the first vote going up for Alpa, you'll see the SNP MPs and MSPs rediscover their immediate enthusiasm for Scottish independence, because all parties react to the political base. And if the political base is threatened, then they get back to doing what they're meant to do in the first place. Now, the SNP needs to be galvanised. It needs to be galvanised back to independence. So make no mistake, as Neale says, if, against my expectations, in 1 year's time, we were promised a referendum, no ifs, no buts, if you remember. If that happens, there'll be no difficulty in Alba, and I suspect every other independence force in Scotland uniting in that campaign. If there is a plebiscite election, then Alba will make the offer, which I did last week, to say let's fight it as Scotland United, because that's the only way you could possibly win a majority in a plebiscite election. There's no difficulty with that whatsoever. But in terms of the continued prevarication, the inability to bring matters to the crunch, Alpa's route's clear. We've got to compete in the field of politics. And we've got the great satisfaction of knowing we don't have to wait a generation until Alpa becomes the colossus. That every success that Alpa has will galvanise Scottish politics towards independence.
Very much to Jim for your questions there. The next question's an easy one, I would say. If there was a snap general election, would Alba be putting candidates forward?
Yes.
Next question is from Dave from Hilton. And his first question is the transition to Alba leading towards us, dividing to conquer and playing into London's hands. His concern is that the presence of Alba in the last Scottish elections cost us the majority.
Well, exactly the opposite. I mean, Firstly, there was an independence majority because the Green Party, at least nominally at least, in favour of independence, and the fact that the SNP didn't win a majority was compensated for by the Greens picking up seats on the parliamentary list. Now, if the SNP had accepted the argument of Alapa, that's for people to vote. And remember, we're the only party which told people to vote for another party at constituency level. We told people to vote in constituency for the SNP and on the list for Alapa. And if the SNP had reciprocated, there would be, let's say, half of the SNP voters had voted for Alapa. There would be around 20 less unionist MSPs in the Scottish Parliament and around 20 more independents supporting MSPs in the Scottish Parliament. And instead of independence being a narrow majority in the Parliament, it would be a 2/3 or more majority, the super majority in the Parliament. And of course, these Alapa MSPs, what would they be doing now? What would be the justification for having an Alapa supporting MSP as opposed to a Green supporting MSP, or what we have, the SNP? Well, if there was Alapa supporting independence MSPs, there would be an independence referendum bill in the Parliament right now. If they were in the Parliament, that's or even Conway were in the Parliament right now. That's what would be happening. We wouldn't have to ask somebody else to do it, suggest it might be a good idea. It would be happening. So it's just the opposite. The Scottish parliamentary elections are such. I mean, I remember back in 2011 when we looked at the system and said, look, although Brian Wilson and the Labour Party devised this system with the thought of excluding an SNP majority for all time, that if you looked at the system carefully and you saw the constituency and the list, and you gave people a reason for voting in the list which was greater than voting the constituency, in the case of 2011, Alex Salmond for First Minister, we said, look, that list, that tells you who's going to be First Minister. And that meant we got a great vote on the list, which enabled us to get an absolute majority. It's perfectly legitimate looking at a political system and say, how do you get the most seats for independence out of that political system? That's what you do. That's why you have politics. And there's no question whatsoever that a supermajority would have been greatly to Scotland's benefit at the present moment. So far from dividing the movement, it was an opportunity to enhance the case for independence. Now, if the Scottish National Party want Alapa to go away, a very simple recipe for that, then achieve independence. do what is meant to be on the tin. And the reason that people have doubts on a range of issues, but a principal reason for having doubts is the lack of urgency in the independence case. People genuinely don't understand. I mean, I can understand the first 2 or 3 years after the referendum. I can understand everything up until Brexit. But I don't understand the lack of urgency since Brexit. I don't understand the lack of political pressure. I would have thought the last 6 years have been a heaven-sent opportunity for Scotland. You know, I didn't agree with David Cameron and George Osborne, Chancellor and the Prime Minister back in 2014. They were Conservatives. I didn't agree with them. I didn't much like them. But they were political giants in comparison with what's there now. And I just gently say that, you know, the government I led only required one mandate to hold an independence referendum.
I'll just make one very brief point on that question, which is, you know, if there was real appetite and ambition for independence in the SNP, I wouldn't be sitting here tonight and I wouldn't be a member of the Alba Party. The reason that I am here is because there are certain elements within the Party of Independence who would rather surrender seats, the seat that I won, completely winnable seat. They're happier to surrender seats, to throw colleagues under the bus, to sideline talent like Joanna Cherry, and to undermine the cause of independence. I don't think that's good enough. If, you know, we gave collectively, Scotland gave MPs in 2015 a very clear instruction. And I remember the last conference in Perth, and Alex's last conference as leader, and the outpouring of support and passion for him in the streets of Perth that evening. We gave the SNP a mandate from the movement to progress independence. And when I discovered that there wasn't even on the agenda, I don't think that's acceptable, and I don't think speaking up about that is splitting the movement. The movement needs to know the truth, and that's why I took that step, and we will continue to campaign for independence regardless of the prevarication of others.
I've got on my phone here a load of front pages from the National. You've probably seen them, but basically over the years it's today we march to demand Indy Rev 2. FM, get ready for Indy Rev 2. Now let us win independence. Game on. I mean, there's literally about 20, 30 front pages where the SNP First Minister has said, this is it, we're ready. And they've built people's hopes up, and then nothing has happened. So, sadly, all I can see are front pages that we've been lied to. So, we have to hold them to account, which is why we have to talk positively about Indy Rev 2 next year. And I know that a lot of people are doubting it, but we've got to be positive, we've got to be focused. They've said October next year, we have got to hold them to it.
And thanks to Dave from Aberdeen for that question. Next question is from a David Leslie, and he's asking the panel here to list in order of importance and their reasons why. So the first one is party loyalty, country loyalty, or constituent loyalty. You'd like to go first? Neale?
Three answers: independence, independence, independence.
I would go constituents loyalty first, because it's the people who are suffering from the current constitutional arrangements, and they are part of the country in which I live and care deeply about. And then party is a vehicle. Party is able to deliver what is in the best interests of our people. So I'm loyal to the cause of independence, first and foremost.
Thanks, Neale.
Well, independence loyalty first. I was a member of the SNP for 45 years, so I wasn't exactly fly by night. I should have hung on for 50 and got a discount. But no, independence loyalty. I mean, I suspect, at least I hope, that kind of story that I grew up politically in the SNP. It'd been very fine independence campaigners didn't, incidentally, and there's no, I'm not on the contrary. I mean, you take people like Alex Neale or Jim Sillars. I always thought they carried a particular conviction because they had the conviction of the convert, which people have to think about a change in their attitude that says a lot for people. Means they've thought their way to a new destination. So I've always been comfortable and happy with that. But I cut all my political teeth in the Scottish National Party, and I was telling somebody at the last weekend at the Stirling Alpa conference, I said it reminded me of the Inverness conference of the Scottish National Party in 1984, because it, like our conference at the weekend, had great disputatious debates about constitutional conventions and sovereignty, and that conference was hugely important because it helped frame my political views. Listening not just to the side I was on, arguing with Neil McCormack and Jim Sillars, But listening to the other side, to Jerry Fisher and Jim Fairley and Jordan Wilson and the arguments that they were putting forward, because you can't test arguments to face your opponents unless you've had that schooling in your own party, and that's why debate in political parties, which unfortunately seems to have largely vanished from the SNP, is really important. And that's why the debates in the 1980s, when the SNP had 2 MPs, like Alba has now, were really important in preparing the party for the future. But there's an interesting thing about that debate. You see, it was a passionate debate. I'm talking about the Inverness one in 1984. And it ebbed and flowed, and it was a sensationally good debate. And the people on both sides, I mean, I didn't agree with Gordon's strategy for independence. I thought it was too narrow. I didn't agree with the way Jim Bailey articulated it. And I agreed with Jim Sillars and Neale McCormack. But not for a second, not for a single second, did I doubt the commitment of the other side of the argument to independence. That wasn't it. We just had a different idea about how to get there. And something for which I'm going to say I'm a fallibility, that I assumed, because that was the case for the vast majority of my time in the Scottish National Party, that every single member was there for independence. Might disagree on tactics, of course, but they were there for independence. I'm afraid what I didn't realise or have enough sensitivity to, that as the party became more successful, as we replaced the Labour Party as the dominant party in Scottish politics, a substantial number of people joined the SNP, not because they believed in independence, but because the SNP had power and influence and finance and could give them grants. And that's sometimes the way it is. That's what happens to political parties when they gain power. They get hangers-on. And I don't really mind hangers-on, but I do mind it if the hangers-on have independence as a subservient objective. And they have a range of other things that they're really concerned about. And independence, we were given 3 choices there, which for some of these people, independence wouldn't be in the top 10. Never mind the top 3. That's all. People have the right to expect that independent supporting parties will be full of people to whom independence and what it can achieve for Scotland in terms of social and economic transformation is their single and overwhelming priority. That's what the SNP were like in the 1980s. That's what Alba is like now.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to David Leslie for that question. The next question is, how can the Indie movement clearly communicate that joining the EU is years away, after it's only months, and the common travel area means no trade restrictions with the rest of the UK? Or am I wrong? You've partly answered it, Alex.
Well, the common travel area means no personal restrictions, right? It's been in place since the 1920s. It's the Irish Republic has been in it all that time. Isle of Man, Channel Islands. So no restrictions on people. There's a common travel area. It doesn't mean no restrictions on business. And I gave the example of the Northern Irish Protocol at the present moment, and why we shouldn't be frightened of that, because there's a huge advantage in being part of the single market with no restrictions and a fairly minor inconvenience of something like the Northern Irish Protocol. And it's very seldom in politics, you argue about what's going to happen if you actually get a working example which proves your point. And that's why I find it irritating that people are not looking at the Northern Irish example and saying, goodness, there's an indication of what will happen to Scotland. And it's been overwhelmingly positive for the economics of Northern Ireland, which of course is why last year a majority of people this year voting for the Northern Irish Assembly are in favour of the protocol. Something you hardly ever hear from the UK media. Why is that? Because they know it's working economically.
Okay, the next question is, just now there's an open goal. How does the Indie movement shoot and score? Neale?
Well,
It's not going to shoot or score by meekly sitting on the sidelines and calling for general elections. So it would actually see the number of independent supporting MPs reduce. The current opinion polls suggest that the SNP could lose up to 10 seats if there was a general election now. So it just seems utterly bizarre that that would be a gambit you would promote. We need all of the things that we've discussed already, the courage to push forward with independence, to introduce the legislation, to force the issue, and to unite. I go back to the point about all of the independent supporting MPs working collaboratively. It would have been fantastic if we had had some support from our Scottish colleagues during our challenge to the Prime Minister, to Boris Johnson, on his penultimate PMQ. That would have been, I think, even more powerful. But that is only one intervention. We could have interventions staged repeatedly. They don't all have to be walkouts. They can't all be the same. But you can use the Erskine May Guide and the standing orders to your advantage. You can interrupt business in a way that is slick and clever and part of standing orders, but it can bring Westminster to a screeching halt. And those tactics are not being employed at all. And now, the best will in the world, Kenny and I can't do that between the two of us. We can do some of it, and we chose our moment very carefully when we did, in collaboration. We had a good debate in the party leadership about how we chose that moment, and it was the most important moment, the most obvious moment, because the eyes of the world were on Boris Johnson, because this was his first PMQ after his annihilation by his own party. And we took the headlines. It wasn't about Boris Johnson's PMQ, it was about Scotland's independence, and that's no stunt.
I'm a great believer in people power, and I think that there are many routes that collectively we can take towards independence. So while Neale and Kenny are doing their heroics, and it is awful going into that cauldron in Westminster and having all the racist comments thrown at you, and no support from so-called Scottish colleagues either. So, you know, that's one action. There are events like this, but you know, we need to get angry. We need to get really angry and start to rise up, and when there are marches, to turn out in full, and not just to get to the end of the march and then just go home and think, well, you know, we've done okay. To stay on and listen to the speeches and turn up in numbers. You know, I was just reading a while ago about the Romanian revolution, which brought about the fall of Ceausescu. And the people rose up and they got rid of Ceausescu in an unarmed, peaceful way, and they achieved it in under 3 weeks because they got so angry. Now, look at the way that Westminster is treating us at the moment, with energy bills, mortgage increases, interest rates. You know, what is it going to take to get us that angry?
I worked in Romania just following the revolution, and it was someplace at the time, very interesting. The next question's from Jackie, and she's asking, will education, in brackets university, still be free after Indy? Thanks.
The rocks won't melt with the sun.
We'll move on to the next question. It's from Bill Murphy, and part of your question's already been answered, Bill, but we'll read it out anyway. Do you think we should go through the Scottish Parliament and pass a law to have a referendum any time we require one? And when we win independence, should we join EFTA till we get on our feet? Neale?
Yes and yes.
Let's just explore the EFTA thing. Obviously, we dealt with the question, probably came in before we talked about EFTA. So you're right on EFTA. The reason for the initiating a bill in the Scots Parliament can be twofold. One is an instrument of political pressure. Back in 2012, when I was trying to persuade, drag, force, cajole Cameron and Osborne to the agreed referendum position, the Section 30, one of the tactics I used was to make sure that they knew full well that if they didn't agree, then we'd have our own referendum. And I made sure that they knew that the bill was being prepared. Incidentally, that if you're doing it that way, you're best to have a referendum that will succeed in court, not one that's very likely to fail in court. That's part of the tax. So you can either use that as an instrument of pressure. Why was that important? Because Cameron didn't want, the last thing he wanted was the idea that Scotland was being denied its democratic rights that it voted for in 2011, and then was going ahead and having its own referendum, because he knew inevitably that we'd win that referendum. And therefore it was far better, as he saw it, for to agree the referendum. So yes, we agreed the referendum, etc., because he was confident that he was going to win. Binary choice between independence and status quo. Now, a week to go, of course, he wasn't so confident. He was phoning everybody his auntie. He was phoning Obama. He was phoning President Putin. He was phoning Angela Merkel, who told him it was none of her business. He was phoning Her Majesty the Queen, the late Queen, to get their support. So panicked was he, as he's admitted in his rather turgid autobiography. He was very confident, arrogant almost at the time. But one of the instruments we used for pressure was to take the initiative. Politics, if you're negotiating, is about making the other side do something they don't want to do, because the alternative to them doing it is less palatable than agreement. That's the art of politics. And you've got to understand the Westminster system. To enable to defeat it, you've got to understand it. And I don't see anything in the current tactics being employed which leads me to believe they're going to be successful, or even that they understand what the points of pressure are on the UK government. Even when we've had governments as weak and as inept and incompetent and useless as the UK government over the last few years, and particularly over the last 6 months. That phrase, remember, England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity. Daniel O'Connell used it in the mid-19th century. That shows more acute sense of politics than what we've seen of late. Westminster's difficulty is the moment. You don't just look at what you're doing and what your beliefs are, and you prepare as best you can, you mobilise as best you can. You've got to strike at the time when your opponents are weak. And what more weakness could have been displayed than what's been displayed over the past few years and over the past few weeks in particular.
Thanks, Phil, for your question. The next question is from Eva Comrie. In January 2020, the First Minister, Ms Sturgeon, offered to create a constitutional convention. A, why has this not happened yet? Maybe we should ask her. B, will the First Minister do it now? And C, if so, will ALPA promote and participate there? Neale, do you want to take this first?
Thanks, Eva. I think the reason that it hasn't happened, from my experience based on what I've witnessed, is that there hasn't been any real meaningful activity on independence in the SNP, certainly over the last 3 years. There's little preparation, and I think that's borne out with the recent economic paper, because it was kind of like a rehash edit of the Growth Commission with some slight tweaks here and there, but it wasn't a coherent piece of work, and it gifted so many opportunities to opponents to pull it apart. With regards to whether she will do it now, I hope so. I hope so. But then, that's tempered by my experience and whether there's the courage there to do it or the will. I don't know which is lacking. But certainly the timid approach is not working and not giving me any confidence. And if there's one called, will we take part? Of course we will. Absolutely, 100%. And we'll continue to call for those types of initiative to assert our voice.
There's also a slight question from Robert Reid. I bust the microphone. It's working again. The question from Robert Reid, which is relevant to this as well. He says, I've seen some SNP representatives say a constitutional convention would be just a talking shop. What would it actually advance in terms of the cause of independence? Well, the proof is that basically in history, every nation which has been claiming its independence has had something like a constitutional convention. That's what countries do. That's what America did. That's what a range of countries which have been obtaining their independence have done. And they've done it because the movement requires legitimacy. And what greater legitimacy can you have than the elected representatives of the people? Is everybody hearing this up the back just now? Right, okay. So the purpose of a constitutional convention is to give the independence movement legitimacy. And that is how you'd style it. It would be an amazing thing to do. We, the elected representatives of the Scottish people, hereby MPs, MSPs declare that the Scottish people are sovereign, and as their representatives, we assert their sovereign right to self-determination. Don't you think that might capture a headline or two internationally? Particularly if it's happening when the UK is in crisis. Of course, it's a key instrument in that political struggle to obtain Scotland's self-determination, but not just as it's been done by so many other countries. It's been done by Scotland. So that's what the Declaration of Arbroath was about. In the Declaration of Arbroath, Scotland was in charge of Scotland. They had a king, stroke First Minister. They had a working council, stroke Parliament. But they still wanted to send a declaration to John the 22nd to say, look, we, the representatives of Scotland, and the barons, the nobles, and the whole community of the realm, that's us, assert our right to Scotland as a nation and our right to independence. That's what you do if you want to become independent. It's part of the independence process, and it's also a huge instrument of political pressure. And that's why it's not just a constitutional act, it's a revolutionary act, and it's peaceful, it's democratic, it's legitimate. Because any conflict between two authorities is a struggle for legitimacy, and it would give the ultimate legitimacy. Now, we are fortunate, and this is why the strategy of so many years ago in that debate in the 1980s in the SNP, because we believe, those of us on one side of the debate, that once we had a government of our own in Scotland, then that would be the fulcrum by which independence could be negotiated. But it needs the backup of a convention of the elected representatives and encompassing civil Scotland, because that's what you do if you want to be successful in the constitutional struggle to obtain independence.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks to Leah Conway and Robert Reid there for your questions. I'm now opening up the questions to the floor, so if anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand. A little bit difficult here, so some of the people at the back, I think there's a hand up there, can't see who it is. We're just getting one for you, sir. Do you want to come up the front and and use this one.
Hi folks, I'm actually Dave from Hilton, and my question was posed with the thing that the background to the question was I felt there was some confusion in the last Scottish election about how to vote, and that was crucial in the end point that although Alex has explained with the divergence with the green vote and things, thank you, I still think there's a hell of a lot of confusion about how to vote to maximise the independent vote between SNP and Alba, and I'm still so that was where the back of the question came from. But further to that, with Westminster with the Tories in such disarray at the moment, how do we seize the day at this point in time when there's obviously no election or otherwise due to take place?
Right, well, on the first one, luckily, I mean, you know, Alpa was...
Did the people at the back hear the question? Thank you.
Right. On the first one, there was very little time before Alpa was formed, days before the Scottish election. So, you know, you can have an argument which is thoroughly great common sense and makes absolute impeccable arithmetic logic. But if you don't get the opportunity to get it across to the people, then you know people look at it like 2 ballot papers, and you need time to get that argument across. The next Scottish elections, if we're waiting that long for independence, then Alpa will have plenty of time to get that argument across, and will do so. In terms of seizing the day, well, that's what we've been talking about. I mean, you know, if you don't wait for elections to happen to seize the day, you bring the day forward by, for example, as we suggested, initiating a referendum bill in the Scots Parliament now. I mean, I don't know if this point came fully across, but one of the helpful things that the Supreme Court identified last week was that Lord Advocate doesn't have to give up permission for a bill. You can take a bill through as a minister in good faith. It means you can get, you know, I know some really good advocates called Joanna Cherry and others who would say certainly that bill is within competence. So a minister can do it in good faith, and also any backbencher can do it. That's how you seize the day. You make something happen. The convention idea, getting the MPs getting the MPs activated and the MSPs mobilised. You know, people sort of say, why aren't the people mobilised? You want to mobilise the people, they have to believe you mean it. You know, what happened in the summer of 2014? You know, when independence went from about 30% to perhaps 50% immediately before the referendum. It went, certainly we know, from 30% to 45%. What was it that galvanised that wonderful summer of 2014? People knew we meant it. They knew it was going to happen. It was worth getting out and spreading the message, because there was going to be a referendum, that we meant it, we were actually going through with it, the opportunity was there. It's like my favourite story, which Denise has heard once or twice, about that queue of folk in the great city of Dundee. You know, when I thought it was happy hour, and it turned out to be a queue of folk registering to get on the voters' roll. And the boy, I said to him, oh, how do you know in the voters' roll? I said to this lad at the back of the queue, no, have you just moved into the city? He said, I've been here all my life. I said, well, why are you not in the voters' roll? He said, I've not been in the voters' roll since the poll tax. He says, but now, at last, there's something worth voting for. Because he knew we meant it.
Quick point on seizing the day, you know, that campaign. I mean, to be able to do that, to be able to seize that moment, to make the opportunity count, you have to be ready. You have to anticipate every opportunity that might present itself. And so the hard work has to be done, even if you haven't got that date set in the diary. You know, and that's just not happening. Bottom line, it's not been happening for many years. You know, and when I went to, we had policy meetings when I was in the SNP on different portfolios, When I went to the Independence one, which was chaired by Mary Black, who was the Shadow Scottish Secretary of State, that meeting started and it was abundantly clear from Mary. She turned up with blank pieces of paper and asked us what we thought she should be doing. There was no strategy, and that's unforgivable. Absolutely unforgivable. And so you have to anticipate, you have to be ready, you have to game all of the different options. It's like the strategy that Alex spoke about with Cameron and Osborne. You know, he considered all of his different options, he had answers to the kinds of tricky questions you're going to get. So you've got to be ready so that, like Estonia in the early 90s, Estonia was just about to be invaded by the USSR military. It was part of the occupied territories of the USSR. They'd been into Lithuania and they caused mayhem there. And because the USSR just went into free fall and collapse, the troops were withdrawn. Estonia had its legislation ready, they got it out in the parliament, they passed it, they voted, and that was it done. And the world accepted that because they asserted it at a time when their oppressor was so focused on other stuff. And that's why you've got to be ready for moments like this. You've got to be ready to act. You've got to have done the graft.
For one final question, we're leaving some time to get your Wee Alba Book signed and get some photographs with any of the members of the panel. So if we've got one final question, I've got a hand up there. Do you want to come down to the front and use the microphone? Just as the people at the back can hear. Thanks, Mark.
I don't know if I need this to speak up. You've spoken a lot in the past about when political change happens, it happens rapidly and it can happen really quickly. Yeah. And you also said that you set out your strategy to replace Labour as the dominant party in Scotland, which you achieved. Is it not a case that there's an even greater opportunity here for the change in Scottish politics to be even more rapid? Because you took the dominant party, Labour, that was effectively a Westminster party, and wedded to socialism, no laughing at the back. And you basically sold the message and the promise of independence. Now, the current incumbent are a party of independence, and regularly get voted back in with huge majorities. So the independence argument in that respect has been won. So I guess my question is, if nothing else changes, bearing in mind that change can happen very quickly, is 2026 really the time where Alba should be focused on effectively either replacing the SNP or terrifying them back into what they're meant to be doing?
I think 2026 must be I'd dearly love there to be a referendum on October the 19th next year. I would dearly love that to happen. I would dearly love to see even one SNP MSP with the guts and the gumption to table a referendum bill next week in the Scottish Parliament. And I would dearly love them to respond to Kenny McCaskill and Neale Hanvey's call to set up a constitutional convention. I would love all of these things to happen, and if they do, they won't just have my support, they'll have Alba's total support. But we have to provide for the possibility they might not happen. And in that case, building up electoral strength at local election level, leading up to the next Scottish Parliament elections is going to be fundamental, and standing in key seats in the Westminster election, and offering the hand of friendship for a Scotland United platform. All these things are going to be important. Of course, I borrowed the concept from Vladimir Lenin, that sometimes decades have no change, and sometimes decades happen in a week in terms of change. But of course, there are other examples in these islands. The Irish Parliamentary Party, as Yvonne was reminding the Alba conference last week, the Irish Parliamentary Party, the party of Parnell, the great Charles Stewart Parnell, who incidentally unwrote the rule book on how to hold Westminster in the palm of his hand with the Irish Parliamentary Party. I mean, for the life of me, I don't understand why with 50
nationalist MPs in Westminster, you can't play Parnell and bring the place to a halt. Of course you could, I could do that, no problem at all. We're 50, easy. And because Parnell showed how it could be done. They've changed the rules a bit, but not that much in terms of being able to do it. So, but what happened to the Irish Parliamentary Party was it was replaced in a single election because there'd been a huge momentous shift in opinion caused by the First World War, the Easter Rising. But basically what happened to the Irish Parliamentary Party is after 50 years, people in Ireland said, well, that hasn't worked. We're going to try something else. But the key point is that the change occurred in one election. In 2015, when people in Scotland had undergone the transformative experience of the referendum, and the Scotland that emerged from the referendum was quite different from the Scotland who'd gone into the referendum. And the Labour Party went down like 9 pence. We remember all their faces, the great figures, Jim Murphy, the Eggman, Douglas Alexander. These figures who were the big figures of Labour politics went down like 9 pence in the 2015 election. So sometimes political change can be dramatic and happen in a single election. Of course it can. But what you have to do is provide the circumstances. Neale's quite right. Political strategy is about anticipating what you're going to do, anticipating what your opponents might do, and work out what you're doing depending on what their reaction is. But that underpins all of this. And why the National Movement Scotland will win, in my estimation, is it has something, whether it's always faithfully followed at representative level or not, it has something which is the rarest gift of all in politics. It has a core of belief, of principle, because the people behind the national movement, the people who vote in SNP and hopefully will vote in Alba, believe that Scotland is a nation, and that nation has the right of self-determination, and by exercising that right we'll build a better Scotland for all the people. That's the belief that is the strength behind the national movement.
Yeah, I go back to what I said earlier about in 2015 when we campaigned for that victory for the SNP, which was really representatives of the 2014 Yes movement. And we sent our MPs to Westminster to settle up, not settle down. Now, we had some real stars. Alex and Tasmania were amongst them. Phil Boswell, another a great advocate for Scottish independence. But what we've got down there now are people who have settled down, are very comfortable in the circumstances that they're in. I don't like going to Westminster. I'll make no bones about it. London has no allure for me whatsoever. So it's not somewhere that I want to get comfortable, but there is far too many people comfortable there, and repeated mandate after mandate after mandate, and no action on independence, but using the cause of independence to secure power for other policies and other priorities. People are going to catch on soon enough. It's totally unacceptable because you're taking the dream that we all share and using it for other purposes, and people can't accept that. The cause is independence.
There is definitely independence fatigue, and that is being brought about because the SNP have had us at the starting blocks, waiting for the starting pistol so many times that in the end people have just thrown in the towel and walked away. However, we have one not so secret weapon that nobody else has got, and that is Alex. Because when it comes to political strategy, nobody can outthink him. You just look at the record. Look at his history, and he's usually one step ahead. The thing that we need to be ready to do is quite often great movements happen through trigger moments. You know, Rosa Parks refusing to get up and give a seat up to a white guy on a bus in Montgomery. There's little trigger points like that that can happen, and we all need to be ready and be ready to move. And because Alex has got this, I don't know, brain that can strategize, when he says move, we need to be ready to move, and it can happen at any time. But as I say, the SNP, they're bereft of ideas, they're bereft of strategy. All they've done is managed to hack off half the independent movement, which is just sort of no longer jumping every time the National comes out with one of its headlines. The time is now. It's like, oh yeah, that again. But there will become a time, there will be a trigger moment, there will be something that happens. And so when Alex says move, we should be like coiled springs and ready to go.
I'm just going to ask you, I want to give a few words of thanks tonight, but I'm going to do it as a winner. So can I thank the Lackeys of Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire? Can I thank the technical guys for the video and the microphones? Can I thank Lewis and staff from the Blue Lamp, or the Lampy as the locals know it? I keep looking over at the bar thinking Sandy Brown's looking at me, Sandy Brown, and I'm sure he'd be supporting us tonight. We're going to have Charlie Abel and friends to give us some musical delights after the book signings and photographs. And I want to thank you all for coming out on such a dreich night and supporting us at our event. And a special thanks to our wonderful panel, Yvonne, Neale and Alex.
So folks, I hope you enjoyed, I can't remember now, was it the 35th or the 36th meeting of the Wee Alba Book Roadshow here in the great city of Aberdeen. So you're all asking yourselves, when's the next one? It's in the great city of Dundee next week, so make sure you take the opportunity to come along and read the Wee Alba Book, to hear great speakers next Friday in the city of Dundee, and keep this roadshow going towards independence. Thank you.
With the panel to pop forward.
Can I have a vote of thanks for the chair?